we can see.
I think I think for the case study today, I will talk briefly about the introduction about the economic reforms and economic integration in Vietnam, why they are intertwined, why they are working in parallel, and they have very high interactions in the case of Vietnam. And after that, we'll talk about the WTO accession as a milestone in Vietnam's economic integration process. The next bit is about the SOE reform process in Vietnam, and we'll focus specifically on the issues of WTO accession negotiations on the state-owned enterprise. And then we'll talk about the outcome of progress of the reforms, and then we'll draw out some lessons. You may wonder why we talk about the case of accession in Vietnam today, and the presentation outline seems to cover a lot related to the reform process, related to the background issues. I think one of the key message that I want to deliver today is that when we talk about the SOE issues under the WTO, especially as part of the WTO accession process, you have two choices. On the one hand, you make a series of commitment as a single package related to the state-owned enterprise, and you're gonna implement all of them upon accession, and that is all. I think that type of scenario would be very tough for each of the members, and including the Uzbekistan. So another alternative is to sketch out a roadmap, including the commitments, a series of commitments that you will phase in over time. So meaning after 1 year after the accession, you will do this, maybe 2 or 3 years, or ideally some 5 or 10 years after that, you can start to phase in other kind of commitments related to the state-owned enterprise. You may prefer to do that, but maybe the existing WTO members will not allow you to do that, and it's your duty to convince the existing WTO members that you're progressing with the SOE reforms now, and you will start to phase in further commitments upon the accessions, and even sometime after that you will continue with your reforms, and that is a precondition to ensure that the members will see this country is progressing with it, and so if we are willing to give more flexibility and ideally give them more time to proceed with that, we'll see in the future that the SOE reforms in the applicant country, in this case the Uzbekistan, will be progressing, and that will help alleviate the pressures for you in the negotiation. So first, in terms of the background, I think I have to say that starting from the renovation process in 1986, we start the economic reforms in Vietnam on a comprehensive front. So we have a number of reforms there, including the reforms on governance issues, the reforms of state-owned enterprise, to the reform of the banking sector, and we also start to liberalize the price. I think in the case of Vietnam, you're probably aware that before 1986, Vietnam was largely under the central planning regime, meaning that the state decide on everything. We decide what to produce, how to produce, how to allocate the output from the production process, and at what price. So the price liberalization also help in this process, because it will return the market incentives or the market signals for the business entities, including the state-owned enterprise, to work efficiently. And I think in this aspect, I think we keep mentioning throughout this case and the next case study, that talking about the state-owned enterprise and the subsidies in Vietnam, they are highly interrelated, and they are also related to the issues of price liberalizations. So you may imagine that for one exporter that of some, for example, steel product, and if they rely a lot on the consumption of electricity for the production process. So if the electricity is price or the tariff is set at an artificially low level, then certainly the beneficiary would be the steel exporters, and so they could have some sort of implicit subsidies there. And so when they export to the other markets, there may be some ground for the other people to including the importing countries or the exporting competitors to raise a complaint that okay, the firms in Vietnam did not receive any subsidies from the government, but they're benefiting from the artificially low price of electricity in that country, and that is something that may be against the market economy principle. And so, but for the purpose of this lesson, I'm breaking out the state-owned enterprise on the one hand, so we will refer directly to the negotiation process, and on the subsidies side, we would have the next case studies. But please bear in mind that these gap issues, in the case of Vietnam, they are very closely related. And on the other hand, we also aim to work on the macroeconomic stabilizations. So we have gone through the years with the hyperinflations of over 800% per year. So we see that this gap issue should not persist. If we don't have a stable macro environment, then people would not be keen on working on reforms. They will rush for key products like gold or food to store, and then they will not making the investment in the production process. And finally, we embark on the open door policy in the old time, and now we upgrade it into the economic integration process. And we'll see later on, the economic integration process in Vietnam are highly interactive with the other pillars of economic reforms, including the state-owned enterprise reform in Vietnam. And so we will see the different periods, like from 1989, 1996, or 2000, 2007, and Vietnam joined the WTO in 2007. So this is one of the key important milestone. And the other period is 2014 until 2019. These are the periods with the comprehensive progress in the economic integrations, and we also saw impressive economic achievement driven by the domestic reforms, including with the reforms in the state-owned enterprise sector. So going into details, the key milestone, the economic reforms and integration in Vietnam. And so we see that Vietnam started the reforms in 1986. So you could see from the left-hand side. And from 1991, we have the first law on the private enterprise and the law on foreign direct investment. Actually, the law on foreign direct investment was started in 1987. But these two laws ensure that the state-owned enterprise are not the single biggest producers in the countries. Instead, they will face competition from the private enterprises, from the foreign enterprises in Vietnam. But after a series of reforms, we faced and opened up the economy. We faced the issues of and the contagion effect of the Asian monetary and financial crisis in 1997. So everything started to slow down. From 2000, Vietnam have the bilateral trade agreement with the U.S., and this is one of the key milestones in the integration in Vietnam, because the U.S., they are very demanding, and they keep pushing that Vietnam will have to make a number of commitments under the bilateral agreements. And even at this stage, I think Vietnam decided to work on that. And an interesting story at that time was that when we completed the agreement in July 2000, a number of political leaders in Vietnam thought that okay, we've done with the US, we've reached a deal with them, so the WTO accession will be coming soon. So everyone would think that we will have no further issue with the US, but that's not the case, because even though the bilateral trade agreement with the US touch on a number of issues related to trade, related to quota on textile and garment, and also even on the intellectual property rights, which is very demanding in terms of the level of commitments. But still, even after that, on the bilateral negotiation process under the WTO accession framework, the US still push further, and they keep making additional comments on a number of issues that Vietnam has to justify, have to make the amendments or even make the or incorporate in our commitment package. So it took another 7 years before we could for extensive negotiation process before we could join the WTO in 2007. And after that, we also have the global financial crisis again, and so we slow down the reforms in a bit. But starting from late 2010, the US and other economies invited Vietnam to join the negotiation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's a ambitious FTA with the new standards on a number of issues. And the state-owned enterprise was also mentioned as a separate chapter in this agreement, and they are also have that issue is also related to a number of issues related to trade in service with the banking sector. They also related to issues of competition policies, how you deal with the competition between the state-owned enterprise and the domestic enterprise, and other how you deal with the issues of the provisions of information of the state-owned enterprise. I mean, what are they doing? What are their profits? And do they receive any support of financial assistance from the government, government-related entities, things like that. And after a while, I mean, there are a number of delay, including with the rise of protectionism and US-China trade war and things like that. So starting from it was only in 2019 that the agreement of TPP was implemented in Vietnam, but under the name of the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, as an amended version of the original TPP after the US withdraw from the agreement. And even in recent years, while Vietnam is implementing other FTAs, we are still pushing on the domestic reforms as a complementary effort to ensure that we are implementing the commitments. But the domestic stakeholders are also having a framework that can match or are compatible with the international commitments related to the state-owned enterprise. And so that is the thing that that we are still working on at this stage. And so the key integration milestone in Vietnam, you can see from that is first, we joined the ASEAN in July 1995 and joined the ASEAN Free Trade Area since 1996. And this is the first framework for trade liberalizations. And we also have a ground for learning and adaptation to trade liberalization in this framework. So, and I think actually under the WTO accession process, we also receive a number of support, or at least the vocal support from the ASEAN members. Some members during the negotiation, they raised support to Vietnam, saying that Vietnam should be treated with some flexibility, including with the special and differential treatment under for example, the subsidies and countervailing measures process. And they said that Vietnam should be eligible for that. Of course, Vietnam can say that, but if there is some additional members that could raise some vocal support throughout the working party meetings, that would be also important as well. And that could be some implications for the people in Uzbekistan, where you say, we are working on with members to negotiate the SOE reforms, the SOE commitments under the WTOs, and we need some support from our members. So you could talk to bilaterally to some WTO members to see whether they would be prepared to raise some support during the meetings for you, and that could be a strategy that could help in the process. And the next bit is with the bilateral trade agreement between Vietnam and the US, and I think we mentioned that. And then after a series of laws and legal reforms in Vietnam, we also had the WTO accession in 2007. And at that time, Vietnam was the 150th member of the WTO. And even after that, we continue with the negotiations, the TPP and and the EU-Vietnam FTAs, and we start to join them in 2019, 2020, respectively. So the key thing is that we have to, throughout this process, we convince the leaders in the country, we convince the stakeholder within the countries, and we also convince the members in of WTO that the WTO has not been the beginning of the economic integration process, nor has it been the end of economic integration in Vietnam. They are part of the economic integration in Vietnam. They are also part of the inducement to the ongoing and continuous economic reforms in Vietnam, including the reforms of state-owned enterprise. So that will be at the broader framework that again, as I said before, this is the most convincing argument to show the WTO members that, okay, Vietnam is still making progress in the reforms, and so we should give them more time to phase in these reforms, including to phase in the commitments related to the state-owned enterprise. We should not strive to ask them that you have to implement all the commitments related to state-owned enterprise upon the accession, because that will be less likely, and Vietnam will need more time to build the capacity for that, and Vietnam also need time to build the domestic consensus for that process. And so for a background on Vietnam's WTO accession, Vietnam was an observer of the GATT in 1994. We launched the application in 1995. We started the formal negotiation in 1998, but the negotiations only intensified during 2002 and 2006. Like I said, after the bilateral trade agreement with the US, Vietnam was very optimistic about the conclusion of WTO accession negotiations. But then we realized that we still had a number of things to do, and so the negotiation only started to increase during the next 4 years from 2002. And in this process, we had the bilateral negotiation with 28 members, and some are very easy. For example, the bilateral negotiation with Cuba. Cuba has been a long time friend of Vietnam, and although they said we'll start the negotiation with Vietnam, for example, but they say, I think from the history, from the documentation, it shows that Cuba had only one round negotiation with Vietnam, very quick, and we also had to complete 14 multilateral negotiations. And we also had and then after an intensified process, we had the protocol of accessions in November 2006, and then we became the member of WTO in January 2007. Now, the next section deals with the state-owned enterprise reform specifically. And so in this process, starting from 1986, when we start to reform the comprehensive reforms in Vietnam, the Communist Party in Vietnam, which is the single leading party in the country, acknowledged the existence and the role of the multi-sector economies. So they say, so from that, the state-owned enterprise are not the only sectors in the country. They would they would have to compete, and they are going to have to work with the private enterprises. They will also have to work with the foreign invested enterprise in the countries. And then on that basis, starting from 1987, the enterprise in Vietnam was permitted to have autonomy in making the decisions related to what to produce, how to produce. And so their production activities became more active, and they also had an independent accounting system. They are not the only their budget, but the budget of state-owned enterprise will not be the same as the state budget, and the state-owned enterprise will have to make use of their own revenues to finance the expenditures, and there will be no compensation of the loss by the state of Vietnam. And in a related aspect is from 1988, when we start to develop a two-tier banking system. So we had the State Bank of Vietnam as a policy maker or as the central bank focusing on just the policy issues, and then the commercial banks, including the state-owned and commercial banks, they work on a commercial basis. From 1989 until 1996, this is one of the first period with the very lively reforms in a number of aspects, and directly in the areas of state-owned enterprise, we have a number of direct measures. For example, we have assign the state-owned enterprise the sale of these companies. We gave some contract to them, and we equitize them, and we also transform some of these state-owned enterprise to other form of ownership. Other kind of direct measures include we merge some of the state-owned enterprise to form the general corporations. So they will be following the model with many subsidiaries, with the holdings and subsidiary model. And we also abolish the direct subsidies to the state-owned enterprise in fundamental. So they will have to work on their own. If they make loss, they will have to be given some time to make changes. But if they don't have time for that, then they will still need to change the management board, or they will seek out some measures from the government for more radical reforms. And some other indirect reforms was related to the price liberalization, like I said. So if we start to liberalize the price for electricity, then the state-owned enterprise in this sector, which is the Electricity of Vietnam Corporation of Vietnam, we have some incentive to make investment, and they will also give some sort of like market signal to the users of electricity. So, for the example, the exporters of agriculture, of steel products, of textile and garment, leather and footwear, they will need to factor in the actual cost or the market-based cost of the electricity. So as to make the relevant make relevant decisions related to their trade activities. The indirect reforms was also related to the encouragement of the foreign direct investment. For example, some of the state-owned enterprise, they are given the chance to form a joint venture with the foreign investor. So if the foreign investors start to come into Vietnam, they are not allowed to set up a 100% company. In some sector, they will need to form a joint venture with the domestic companies, especially the state-owned enterprise in Vietnam. So that will alleviate the difficulties for the domestic state-owned enterprise in terms of finance, in terms of the managerial expertise, and also in terms of the access to foreign market. But that also restrict the choice of the foreign investor coming in. So, and there's also some indirect reforms related to the diversification of the bank ownership. So the domestic firms, the domestic investor will start were allowed to make investment, to own some share of the banks. From 2000 to 2007, we leveraged the momentum for the state-owned enterprise, and in this process, in this period, Vietnam intensified the negotiation for WTO accession. So we have to also show that to the WTO members that we are working on the SOE reforms in Vietnam. And so the state-owned enterprise reform continued via a number of direct measures as before, such as the assignment, the sale, the contract, equitization, and transformation of the to other ownership. And some big general corporations will transform further into some big state business group with a huge and I think if you read the book on Commanding Heights, talking about the major state-owned enterprise producers in the central planning economies, you will see that Vietnam was following exactly the same model. But at least I think on a market basis, we still have a number of mechanisms to ensure that the firm will factor in the efficiency issues when making their decisions, including the decisions related to borrowing from the international market, also including the trading with partners. And there are also other issues in direct reform when we have the enterprise and investment law in 2005. just 2 years before the WTO accessions, to ensure that there be a more level playing field for the state-owned enterprise in Vietnam vis-a-vis the other private and foreign companies in Vietnam. So meaning that in this process, there be no discriminations in terms of the provisions of the land, of the credit to the state-owned enterprise, at least in terms of the black letter law. So with this kind of law, there be no further discriminations in favor of the state-owned enterprise, that they can get access to this resource, they will have access to in terms of the consultation to the policymakers and other things like that. So to ensure that now they will need to work on an even more competitive basis with the private sector. After the in 2008 and 2012, Vietnam had some slowdown. The reform of the state-owned enterprise was slowed down because of the impact of the global financial crisis. So at that time, we focused on containing domestic inflations. We worked on the macroeconomic policies, including the monetary policies, the fiscal policies, and we did not care that much about the domestic reforms at the micro level. And so in this case, there were some notable cases of the state enterprise with the violation of the competition law. So in one case is the firm, for example, some of the company that supply the petroleum products for at the airport, they are effectively a state-owned enterprise, and that in that market they are the monopolistic. They are the monopoly. They are the only supplier there. And on after some negotiation with the users, they did not make the agreement. They didn't have an agreement with the price in terms of the price. So they decided that they will work against the market principle by stopping the supply to the users. And the case went to the competition law, to the competition council in Vietnam. And so that was often mentioned as the first case in the history of competition in Vietnam, when the national competition council decided that state-owned enterprise violated the principle of the competition law, and they were subject to a fine, to an administrative fine of some millions of dollars in the value of that time. But I mean that kind of decision was the first in the history, but it was not enforced eventually, because the firms received the decision, but they did not mean to implement that decision, and there was no mechanism to enforce that decision. So starting from 2013, when Vietnam started to join the negotiation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the restructuring of state enterprise also became a major pillar of the economic reforms in Vietnam. And in this process, we start to have to change the definition of state-owned enterprise with the new enterprise law. And technically, in this process, we say that the state-owned enterprise under this new law, we say the enterprise now are the enterprise that the state hold 100% of the stake of the share. In the previous decision, they also say 51% or higher. But now they start to change with this process, we change the definition of state-owned enterprise to say just 100%. So you could see that the scope of the state-owned enterprise under this new law is smaller. So meaning that fewer state-owned enterprise would be subject to the adjustment scope of the TPP. And then there was also some in this process, the other measures related to SOE reform became less popular, and equitization became the single most important priority. And there are also reforms related to the separation of the state ownership and the state policy-making authorities, and on the competition policies. And I want to emphasize the issues of separating the state ownership and the state policy making authorities. And my institute, the Central Institute for Economic Management in Vietnam, is actually the author of that mechanism to separate the ownership and the policy making function. So you could see that there are some ministry in Vietnam in the previous time. For example, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, they are the representative of the state as an owner of the state-owned of some state-owned enterprise, but they are also making policies related to the operations of those enterprise. So there are some critics that the policy making decision could work in favor of the state-owned enterprise, and that hurt the domestic firms, and including the competitors, including the users in the upstream or downstream sectors. And so after some time, we decided that we need to separate the state ownership and the state policy making authorities. So there are a dedicated authority working as the state owner of the big corporations in Vietnam. And the other for the other ministry, they will need to focus on just on the policy making authorities. So for example, for the electricity company of Vietnam, the Ministry of Industry and Trade now just work on the infrastructure policies, just work on the electricity tariff company policy, and they are not and whether the firms will make profit or making loss will no longer be their responsibility. But still, there are other type issues. For example, there are some foreign ownership limits at the domestic banks, including the state-owned commercial banks. And I think at this after the WTO accession, Vietnam did not relax the foreign ownership limit at the domestic banks, even under the TPP or CPTPP, because as a latecomer, Vietnam have had a very tough negotiation with partners, including the United States. And so we say we make a huge WTO plus commitment in the service sector, in the banking sector. So we don't want to go further in the subsequent FTAs. And most recently, under the EU-Vietnam FTA, we just have we just have some relaxation, or we could say some compromise, by giving a memorandum there. But the memorandum is still very flexible in terms of wording. It says something like Vietnam will consider favorably the proposal by two European financial institutions to hold up to 49% of the share of the state of two commercial banks in Vietnam, except for the four major state-owned commercial banks. So it means that the state-owned commercial banks are not the subject of that relaxation. So it also means that could be the government is still want to retain control over the state-owned commercial bank sector. So the key, I think, from this process, I think the key implications for the new WTO members are that first, they will need to ensure that the SOE reforms works in parallel or in consistency with the WTO accession negotiations. Be mindful of the fact that during your negotiations, the WTO members will have the right to ask you questions, to seek your clarifications, to seek your information. And they can also draw information from various sources, including from the media, from the internet, and things like that, about the performance of the state-owned enterprise in your country. And so if you are not making progress, or at least you are not showing that you are about to make progress, then they will be inclined to think that you are not making good progress in terms of economic reforms in general, in terms of SOE reforms in particular. And why would we be assured that you will continue to make progress after the WTO accession? And if we are not satisfied with that, of course, it will depend on the progress in other issues as well. But if we are not satisfied with that, certainly we think that more time is needed before we can be certain that the SOE reforms and the SOE commitments will work for your applications. And the next issue is then we need to depending on the progress with your state-owned enterprise reform, depending on the space for making further reforms, then you need to develop some scenarios for the SOE commitments under the WTO. So one thing is that you have the accession bound only. So meaning that the agreements, the commitments will be implemented immediately upon the accession to WTO, or you will be allowed to have a roadmap for phasing in the commitments after accession. So 1 year after this, 1 year after WTO accession, you will do this. 2 years you will do that. 10 years later you will do that. So, and I think, and the other thing is that for the state-owned commercial banks, would you be willing to make this kind of thing related to on the trade side of it, or you will have the commitments in terms of service, in terms of the state-owned enterprise or state trading enterprises, in terms of competitions or on other legal, on other chapters that can be related to that. And of course, I think there could be other consideration as well, and I think that are not mentioned here. For example, in the case of Vietnam, one common argument that we have to make throughout the process is that Vietnam is at that time Vietnam was a low income country. We have the GDP per capita of less of just $400 or $500 per person in that year. So we're very much like a low income country. So we wanted to be treated with flexibility, with special and differential treatment under the WTO. But a lot of members were saying that, okay, we acknowledge the fact that you're a low income country, but we do see that you can have a very strong potential to grow in the future, and that's why we want more stake from you, and we asking from you. We are not asking from you, but now, but those kept asking will be against your future, and and for the state-owned enterprise, that could be one issue that could be relevant, because if you are making good progress in the state-owned enterprise, meaning that in the future you will still have a good progress, and perhaps that will contribute to the economic development of your country, and that could also be some as a paradox. That could also means that people will be asking more from your country. But that is not the purpose of my discussion today, and I'm not going to have a strong argument for or against that. But just be mindful that because this issue can be related to a number of issues, including the broader economic regimes, including subsidies and things like that. So be mindful of the cross-sector considerations during the negotiation process is also compulsory. And then now the WTO accession negotiations on the state-owned enterprise. We have a number of so we also had that a number of progress in recent years. We also had the new development in the I think this is that is the typo here in saying that this is it should be 2003 and in 2003. I will have a send the corrected slide after this. But I think in terms of the Working Party in May 2003, Vietnam started to Vietnam was submitted and making presentations on number of developments in the reforms of the state enterprise, and we're converting them into equity ownership, i.e. the equitization process. We also, I think in the case of Vietnam, I think just in terms of wording, we did not use the word privatization of the state-owned enterprise. We just used the word equitization. And I think, and we also create a fund for the SOE reforms. And we have But still, the members show some general concerns or requests for information about the trading rights, about the broader economic regimes, and among others. For example, in terms of the number of sectors like minerals, would the private firms or the foreign direct investor have the right to export these products, or it's just belong to the state-owned enterprise? That is one thing that you need to consider. And the second thing is, what is the relationship between the SOE and the broader economic regime? Yeah, it emphasized the need to have the leading role for the state economic sector. But is there an implication for the state-owned enterprise sector, or you're just trying to provide some subsidy in this form or the other to these enterprise so that they can leverage on their leading role? So there are a number of concerns and requests for that, and Vietnam had to make the rectifications. And in December 2003, Vietnam insisted that it list of state trading enterprise is comprehensive based on the WTO provisions, but still the members call for information on these enterprises and a number of SOEs to see whether they comply with it or not. So meaning that just the list of the company, the detailed information on them may be a necessary condition, but may not suffice for the justification process. Later on in 2004, some members request more information on the state-owned enterprise in Vietnam. What are they producing? What are they doing? And are they assuming some role in international trade? And I have to say that one of the key issue in that process is for example, in terms of trade, is the export of agricultural products. And indeed, Vietnam has two big companies, two big state-owned enterprise, the Vinafood 1 and Vinafood 2. They are the major producers and exporters of the agriculture product. Vinafood 1 is in the northern provinces. Vinafood 2 is inside the southern provinces. So they are the major state-owned enterprise in the sectors, and they are very much engaged in international trade in agriculture. And there was some question about them. And Vietnam, in this process, we had to make the justification saying that we have narrowed the list of the state-owned enterprise, and that the activities of the SOE were not just on a purely commercial basis. Then be some considerations related to national defense, to security, and even the social aspect like poverty elimination. But even in in September 2005, just before the National Assembly meeting in Vietnam, which is scheduled to issue a number of laws related to WTO accession, and I think the members were reminded of this fact that Vietnam will be changing some law in the meantime. But still, there are some one comment in the process calling for the clarifications of a number of central issues for this member, including the state-owned enterprise. So it means that even toward the end of the process, there could be still some questions related to the issues of state-owned enterprise. And I think, and throughout the process, Vietnam also makes several notifications on state trading enterprises. We had the first submission in 2000, and then we had 3 subsequent revisions. And the last revision was in 2006, just before the conclusion of the negotiation for WTO membership. But interestingly, in the final revisions, Vietnam just have a very short list. In that process, in that short list, we had just 6 products and with the name of 15 enterprises. But compared to the original notification, this is a much shorter version. In the original version, we had 13 products, 106 enterprises, either named or unnamed. So it means that SOE negotiation is tough. SOE negotiation can be tricky, and it can be a lengthy process. And even toward the end of the process, you still have to receive some question on that. But receiving question actually can be good, because you have the chance to talk to partner and and make further clarifications to the partner. But if people don't ask you, maybe you can't be assured that they are satisfied with our justification. Maybe they will not, maybe they are not happy with it, but then they don't want to ask further, and that is not a good signal for the negotiation process. So the lesson here is that if you receive question about it, don't be afraid, don't rush, and don't think that the member are still concerned about this issue. They are also always concerned on a number of issues. So it's your task to convince them that they will not object to you proceeding further in the negotiation process. And so in some way, indeed, with your justification, you may be able to go further, not just in terms of the commitment, making commitment, but you can also narrow the scope of your commitment. So we have to short the list here as an example. So it does not necessarily mean that in this lengthy process, you will have to increase the number of firms, the number of products, and the SOE commitments over time. Indeed, you can start from a long list and have a negotiation for shortening this list. So the key commitments we had under the WTO accession related to the state-owned enterprise, and like I said, these are just the direct commitments related to state-owned enterprise. There are other kind of commitments that could be related, including the areas of trade and service, including tariff, etc. But these are the things that have the direct implications for state-owned enterprise. And so first, Vietnam has no definition on state trading enterprises. And in Vietnam, the scope is that only the state-owned enterprise are those that, including the equitized enterprise, that the state own more than 50% of the shares. And so that is the definition in Vietnam, and that is accepted within the WTO framework. And in general, the compliance, the SOE in Vietnam will have to comply with the WTO principles on non-discrimination. So, and the commercial considerations, they will have to work only on commercial considerations, especially with respect to the export and import decisions. And indeed, there are these commitments are only for the from the wordings. These commitments are only for the state trading enterprises, but not necessarily for the state-owned enterprise. But Vietnam makes specific commitments for the SOE and state trading enterprise. In that, we don't have, in our law, we don't have the state trading enterprises, which have the state-owned enterprise. But our specific commitment is that regardless of the legal form of the legal wording, they will have to rely only on commercial considerations in their trade decisions, no discrimination, and no direct or indirect intervention by the states. So the next bit is how did WTO members see our performance after the WTO accession? At this stage, Vietnam has completed two trade policy reviews. The first one in 2013, the second one was last year in 2021. I was fortunate enough to join the trade policy review process, including the version last year. And so there are a number of comments related to this process. And I think in our report, there will be two reports: the report by the government of Vietnam and the other report by the Secretariat. So in the report by the government of Vietnam, in the first TPR process, we'll say that the regarding the reorganization of the state-owned enterprise, we had a master plan on restructuring the state-owned enterprise, focusing on the state economic group, the general corporations, and this approved by the Prime Minister, and which instruct the ministry to classify the SOE according to the nature of their activities, their role in the economy, and the desired level of state ownership. And the master plan reiterates the classification and reorganization of state-owned enterprise with the objectives that SOE are concentrated in the defense ministry, natural monopolies, high-tech sector, and in the industry supplying primary goods and services. So you could see that the language under the report by the government of Vietnam are quite general, focusing on the information only, no assessment, thing like that. And we also set out some target here saying that the state would equitize nearly half of the more than 1,300 state-owned enterprise. The remaining one would be reorganized into 44 economic groups. And the master plan also instructs the state-owned enterprise to restructure their investment portfolio and business line. So they will have to divest to divest their non-core business. They should not be working on too many areas. And also in the joint stock companies, that the state does not need to be the dominant shareholder, then the divestment process will need to continue. But but there is also a parallel report on TPR by the WTO Secretariat, which is longer, more detailed, and rely on information from various sources. For the report of the government, they have to rely on inputs from the government agencies. But the WTO TPR report by the Secretariat rely on everything they can find, including the evidence from the research report, evidence from the or the arguments mentioned under the various newspaper in Vietnam, including the online portal. And so you could see here they could have some assessment, like when they talk about the competition, market competition, they can say something like the distortion to competition can be the consequence of the government intervention policy and of weak policies to address anti-competitive practice of large business group, including those of state-owned enterprise. So they say the wording here can be. They are not making a definite judgment saying that the distortion are the consequence, but they say it can be. So I think you can see that there can be some pushing in this in the language. And the authorities remain concerned about the potential job losses and corporate insolvencies after free rein is given to market forces in sensitive activities dominated by the state-owned enterprise. So they may say that, they may imply that the government of Vietnam is also concerned about a number of issues related to job creations after they reduced the support to the state-owned enterprise. That is one of the key implications. And they also have some judgment, some arguments saying that the FDI firms seem more efficient and more competitive than the state-owned enterprise. And then, so I think this kind of assessment can see that they talk about a number of issues. So one good thing from this process is that if you are not making SOE reforms after the WTO accession, then your performance will be reflected a lot in the TPR process, and that will be have some sort of implications to your implementation process. And the second trade policy in review in Vietnam said that during the reporting period, the government of Vietnam had drafted a new enterprise to replace the law of enterprise law in Vietnam. And in this new law, we have the definition saying that enterprise where the state hold more than 50% of charter capital, the number of voting share according to regulations. This provision is in accordance with commitment in several international treaties and to which Vietnam is a party, such as the the CPTPP, the EU-Vietnam FTA. And so that they say that in that report saying that the Prime Minister had some decision to on the criteria to classify the SOE for equitizations in 2016, 2020, and then we have the transformation of the state-owned enterprise into the model of a joint stock company, and the resolution to establish the Commission for the Management of State Capital Enterprises. So this is the process that I mentioned before. Under the advisory of the Central Institute for Economic Management, Vietnam decided to separate the ownership function of the state-owned enterprise with the policy-making function of the government agencies. So, and in 2019, the Prime Minister of Vietnam issued a decision saying that we still have a number of state-owned enterprise to equitize by 2020. So you will have to face ambitious, progressive process to complete this equitization process. And so during there was a report from Vietnam saying that during 2016 2020, 174 equitization plans were approved by the competent authorities. But you could see that the approval of the equitization plans was just one step forward. It's not the end of the equitization process. Is yet, because this is just talking about the plans only, and it's one part of the equitization process. But the review by the Secretariat in 2021 said that there is some concern over the National Competition Council's independence and impartiality, particularly when the SOE are involved in an anti-competition cases. So you could see that they are not working just about the commercial consideration of the state-owned enterprise as the direct commitment, but instead they also talk about the issues related to the competition of the state-owned enterprise with other enterprises. And they said that the state-owned enterprise plays a critical through declining role in the production, processing, and trade of agricultural products. And they also said something like during the review period from 2013 to 2019, the authorities focused on the restructuring of state-owned enterprise to promote equitizations and divestment of investment capital to achieve efficiency of state capital. So they could seek this information from the government report. They could seek information from various non-government information sources. But like I said, if you're continuing with the SOE reforms after WTO accession, there may be some favorable wording from the Secretariat point of view, but there can be also some other less favorable wordings. But their report will reflect what you are doing. So, and you can have the chance to make comments to them, to reflect to reflect your input to the report by the Secretariat. So if you are making progress in SOE reforms, they will have to acknowledge that, and I think that they will certainly acknowledge that, because it shows that the WTO accession is also progressing in your country. You are progressing with that. You are complying with the commitments, and you are even going further by trying to align the SOE with the efficiency promotion. And so the report by some recent reports shows that Vietnam is making progress in the SOE reforms. During 2011-2015, Vietnam equitized 518 state-owned enterprise and their subsidiaries. The Ministry of Finance in 2021-2022 talking about the approval of the equitization plan for enterprises, but still there are a number of firms of enterprise that are not that were not missing the deadline, and Vietnam divests the state capital from 18 SOEs with the value of more than 1.6 trillion dong, and with the proceeding at 4.4 trillion dong, and that so it means that the book value is quite small, but the market value can be big. So it shows that once the state is willing to divest, the private investor, the foreign investor, would also be keen to pay above the book value. And but a recent assessment by my ministry, the Ministry of Planning Investment, said that the equitized SOE also had some improvement in the efficiency, but still, for the state-owned enterprise sector as a whole, they still remain inefficient. So finally, there'll be some key lessons. I think the first thing is, like I said from the beginning and throughout this presentation, you need to to develop a credible and sufficiently long-term plan or strategy for the state-owned enterprise that are tied and consistent with the economic integration process. And you have to show that even while you're still awaiting the membership, you're still progressing with the SOE reforms, and you're making good, you're giving good signals that even after the WTO accession, we still continue with the SOE reform process. I think it's very hard to convince the WTO the existing WTO members that if you are not progressing with the SOE reforms now, what will be the momentum for you to implement after the WTO accession? So I think it's very hard to convince the WTO members on that. And so if you're serious about expediting the negotiation for accession, then this cap issue should be something that at the domestic level there can be some argument, but it also work from the efficiency perspective. But at the negotiation level, that also help with the negotiation team to make some sort of like convincing arguments to the members, so that your proposed scenarios, including for flexibility, can be considered. And if you consider the WTO accession as the endpoint, saying that, okay, we just have the WTO accession here, and we are not going to go further on the economic integration process. So what we are making there will stay there forever. We are not going to go further, and we've strived hard enough. So I think this is the final standards. No further, no further progress after that. Then it's going to be very hard to convince the WTO members that you can continue with the WTO with the SOE reforms after the WTO membership, because they say if you're not progressing with the economic integrations, what would be the standards? What are the mechanisms to align your performance after the WTO membership? That then be no alignment after that. So of course we can rely on the TPR, but the TPR is just a review process. So we need to take this. We better take it seriously before granting you the membership. So that is something from the strategic consideration you need to consider. And then finally, in terms of SOE, are very important. They are cross-cutting. They are related to a number of issues. They are even related to political career or rewards for a number of people. So making reforms on the SOE is easier said than done. And that's why in this process, and especially as part of the negotiation process on SOE issues, you need to build the consensus among the domestic stakeholders. You need to building the consensus about what should be expected. Should we expect the SOE reform to proceed? Should we expect the SOE reforms to go as our plan? What are the trade-offs during negotiations? For example, if we are going for the for a roadmap of the SOE reforms after the WTO membership, is there any trade-off? Then be certain. But is the trade-off will be reflected in terms of the concession in other sectors? We don't know yet, but I think from your point of view, in terms of considering the negotiation in SOE and the negotiation in other areas. You will need to consider the cross-sectoral trade-off during the negotiation. And then you also need to build the consensus on the domestic reform as a complement. So I think in the process, throughout this process, we often have some saying that some stakeholder may say, okay, we just have a well-developed commitment package. We just implement it. We don't need to go further, and we don't need anything in as a complement. But that will not happen in practice. So because in the negotiation process, you want to save the policy space, you want to make less concessions. So, but while you're implementing the commitments in SOE reform, you still need a number of aspects. For example, like I said, in the case of Vietnam, the price liberalization is still on one of the direction that will benefit the SOE reforms. You can't ask the companies to work on a market basis if you're still setting the output price at the artificially low level. So that is one thing that you need to consider. And the second lesson is that you need to have some sort of intensive training for the negotiators. So you have some negotiation skills related to the state-owned enterprise. So negotiation skill here, for example, like there's in terms of the state trading and enterprise, but in your country there may be some like in the case of Vietnam, we don't have a language saying about the state trading enterprises. Even in the TPP process, there may be some alternative wordings like the government trading enterprises. We don't have that. So how would we negotiate over the issues of the wording here? Because that will reflect the scope of the commitment and the number of firms that will be subject to the commitment. And then we also on some intensive trainings for the interagency coordination and cooperation in the WTO negotiations. And my lessons is that the WTO negotiation on the SOEs are very much cross-cutting because it works with firms, it works with the state ownership, it works with the economic regime, so it deals with a number of issues. But so if the people working on agriculture issues are not cooperating with the people working on SOE, including the SOE in agricultural trade, then you have some problem. And if you can't, and talking about this, it is quite a matter of principle. But when we go into technical details, like okay, if we try to promote the trade in agriculture, would that hurt the SOE reform, the SOE in agricultural trade? To what extent the reduction in profit or the cost to the SOE in agriculture trade can be acceptable? We don't know. That these are the things that we also need some intensive training as well. And together with that, we also need to build the capacity for the analysts, policymakers, and negotiators can revert to some technical issues and some legal issues. But on the economic impacts of the different scenarios on what you can negotiate, what are the lower bar or what are the upper ceiling for that you can accept, you will need to build the capacity for the impact assessment. And in terms of the efficiency of the state-owned enterprise, partial equilibrium point of view, this kind of thing can also be critical. And again, also for the lawmaking process, you need a team of legal experts in terms of the people that can adopt the good regulatory practices. So for example, if we talk about SOE issues at the negotiation level, and we want to promote some domestic reforms related to state-owned enterprise, but we don't have enough people to work on SOE related issues throughout the rulemaking process, then the negotiation will also be affected. And finally, you need to get some shared experience from existing members in terms of how do they negotiate, how do they set the promise that they can fulfill after the accession. You will need to do that, and of course, Of course, if you are able to make some promise about accession bound commitments that you can implement immediately after the negotiation, after the membership, that is quite easy that can be quite easy, quite easier at the negotiation level. But at the implementation, you will be in tough position. So, and the second thing is that the SOE related to subsidies, related to the intervention by the state, and so in a number of cases will be related to the issues of non-market economy under the WTO status. Under the WTO, and at this stage, China and Vietnam are still asking for the market economy status under the WTO, but some members are still distant from making the recognition. So it also means that even after the WTO accession, even during the WTO negotiation, some sort of like differences in terms of thought, in terms of the competition across market and non-market economies may still drive the level of commitment, the level of acceptance toward the flexibility that can be granted to Uzbekistan. So in this process, certainly it's not just about us trying to make good progress. It's not just about us trying to set out the scenarios that we can make the concession. It's also important to know which member is the most demanding in this process, so we can say when we develop the scenarios, we can have some dedicated resource and relevant efforts to talk to this member and say, okay, we understand your concern. We have made some progress with that, and we are committed to making further progress with that. And perhaps you can ask some, you can seek vocal support from other members, saying that Uzbekistan is also progressing. Like in the case of Vietnam, we have seen that Vietnam has been progressing a lot before WTO accession, and they did a lot too after the WTO accession. So maybe perhaps there could be an indications of some flexibility for Uzbekistan on the SOE issue could be appropriate. So I think having some that kind of vocal support is also important, but it deals with not just about like the effort of the negotiation team alone, but it also work in terms of the international cooperation of Uzbekistan with the other WTO members outside the WTO framework. So I think with that, I'd like to end my presentation for the first case here.